We're up to Unit 3, Lesson 7. And this particular lesson, our goal is to learn how to solve equations with square roots. We've already started talking about this already, but we're going to look at some more in-depth equations. So right up here in your lesson notes are the steps. The first thing we'll always do is we'll isolate the square root. And what I mean by isolate the square root is to get the square root by itself on one side of the equal sign. So the square root needs to be by itself on one side of the equal sign. Once you do that, then you can go ahead and square both sides like we would normally do and solve for x. The important thing to note, and I talked about why this is the case in the previous lesson, if you end up in the process of attempting to solve an equation, if you end up with the square root of something equals a negative number, the equation has no solution. And I talked about, like I said in the previous lesson, why that's the case. You can't have a positive to square root equal to a negative number. So again, if you end up in the process of attempting to solve the square root of something equals a negative number, you can go ahead and stop. That means there's no solution. So let's go ahead and take a look at the examples. The examples are just a few equations for us to solve. So number one, we have the square root of x plus 4 equals 3. You can see that the square root is already isolated on the left-hand side of the equal sign. So I don't need to do any isolating. I can go ahead and square both sides. Again, why do I square both sides? Because essentially squared and square root cancel each other out because they're opposites of each other. So this gives me x plus 4 equals 3 squared, which is 9. And if I go ahead and subtract 4 from both sides, I end up with 9 minus 4, which is 5. So number one, the solution is x equals 5. Number two, we have, let's see, the square root of 3 minus x minus 4 equals 0. In this case, the square root sign is not isolated, okay? The square root is not isolated by itself on the left-hand side, which means I need to get rid of the minus 4 in order to isolate that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add 4 to both sides. And if I do that, I end up with the square root of 3 minus x equals 0 plus 4. So that's 4. Now that the square root is isolated, I can go ahead and square both sides like I normally would. So that gives me, this cancels this out. So that gives me 3 minus x equals 4 squared, which is 16. I'll now go ahead and solve this for x. So I'll first subtract 3 from both sides, and I end up with negative x equals 16 minus 3. So that will be 13. And then to finish it off, remember this is really a negative 1 times x. So I'll finish this off by dividing both sides by negative 1. And I end up with x equals 13 divided by negative 1, which is negative 13. So x equals negative 13 is the solution to number 2. Number 3, we have 2 times the square root of x equals 20. Once again, the square root is not isolated, so I have to get rid of the 2. Because this is 2 times the square root of x, how do I get rid of times? How do I get rid of multiply? Well, I'm going to get rid of that by dividing. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2 to start off. So that gives me the square root of x equals 20 divided by 2, which is 10. Now I can go ahead and square both sides. So that and that cancel each other out. So I end up with x equals 10 squared, which is 100. So x equals 100 is the answer to number 3. And one more example, number 4. I have the square root of 2x minus 3 plus 9 equals 0. So I have to isolate the square root. Okay, so I need to get rid of the plus 9 by minusing 9 from both sides. So that gives me the square root of 2x minus 3 equals 0 minus 9, which is negative 9. And if I look at my lesson notes, go back to my lesson notes, remember I've mentioned this numerous times, if you end up with the square root of something equals a negative number, the equation has no solution. Okay, in this case, in number 4, I've attempted to solve, and I ended up with the square root of something equals a negative number, and we know that we can't have a positive square root equal to a negative number. So number 4, we can stop right here and say definitively that it has no real number solution, no solution. So that is an example of one that has no solution and what it looks like. That is it for this lesson.